Here we are again. This is the North County San Diego Democracy at Work Action Group, and we are resuming our reading of Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. We have completed Chapter 1. Those readings and discussions, separated into 3 parts, are available online, as this will hopefully be, and if you're listening to this, I assume that's the case. So we're starting Chapter 2, Crisis and Government Response. Frank, do you want to take it away?
Sure. So, I have attached no dates to this chapter's title. Okay, I heard an echo there for a moment. Sorry about that, so I'll begin again. I have attached no dates to this chapter's title. That is because the government response to the crisis that hit U.S. capitalism in 2007 will continue for many years to come. The social and economic consequences and costs of such long-lasting crises extend deeply and widely into a society's future. The impoverished families of the long-term unemployed strained to the point of dysfunction, communities deprived of viable economies, interrupted educations, lost skills, these and many more results of capitalism's crisis will put difficult demands on governments for years. On the one hand, they will aggravate social problems that impose costs on governments. On the other hand, affected individuals and businesses will pay less in taxes to fund local, state, and federal governments. We will all be paying the heavy costs of capitalist crises, both directly in our personal lives and indirectly through declining government services and protections, which is quite apropos, seeing that the government shut down yesterday or this morning.
Right.
I don't know if you heard that or not.
Yes, yeah.
So, continuing. Nonetheless, it is instructive to study the first few years of the U.S. government's response as the economic downturn gathered speed and force in early 2008 and then intensified into full-fledged collapse between September 2008 and April 2009. The collapse occurred most dramatically in the credit system, where it took the form of a credit freeze, lending stopped. It had become clear in 2008 that the number of mortgages that could no longer be serviced by borrowers were larger and growing faster than had been expected. Therefore, the owners of mortgage-backed securities, or MBSs, and other asset-backed securities, ABS, faced not only their declining values, but also great uncertainty about what price they might fetch if and when a holder tried to sell them to anyone else. Uncertainty can destabilize markets even more than rapid price declines. 2 huge investment banks, long active in the MBS market and large owners of MBS, collapsed in 2008. Bear Stearns was forced into a massively discounted handover of its assets to J.P. Morgan Chase, and Lehman Brothers was forced to declare bankruptcy. Their creditors, fearing the implications of the declining values of such investment banks' ABS assets, demanded repayment of their loans and in other cases said they would not renew loans that were coming due. The investment banks could not manage or survive the loan stoppage they faced because of the declining values and prospects of their ABS holdings. These dramatic events, among others that received less publicity, sufficed to freeze credit markets by autumn 2008. Few banks could or would lend to others because every bank knew that other banks held unknown amounts of asset-backed securities whose values were falling, uncertain, or both. To lend to any bank, even overnight, meant risking being told the next morning, week, or month that the borrowing bank could not repay because its ABS values were collapsing and its access to credit had vanished. Other financial enterprises were likewise drawn into the credit freeze. Some held ABS or depended on banks that did. Others had hedged their holdings of ABS, as many banks did, by purchasing credit default swaps as insurance against the defaults that were proliferating in 2008 and 2009. Still others had found new profit opportunities by speculating in CDS themselves, since CDS values rose mostly and fell sometimes as rumors swirled about ABS insured by those CDSs. These acronyms are getting a little tough for me.
Right.
Yet another shock took the credit markets over the edge as they were hit by a three-part punch. As the crisis spread, it emerged first that owners of ABS who had purchased CDS as insurance to cover default risks were turning to the issuers of those CDSs to cash in on that coverage. It next became clear that one of the world's largest issuers of CDSs was the largest insurance company in the world, American International Group, AIG, and that while AIG had profited greatly from premiums it earned by selling credit default swaps, it had not accumulated the reserves needed to pay the claims arriving in 2008 from those holding AIG's CDSs. When this news spread, it further destroyed the values of both CDS and ABS. Credit then stopped flowing throughout a global capitalism that had, over the previous 30 years, come to lubricate ever more transactions of daily life with credit. More and more personal and business activities required and entailed loans. Capitalist countries had all become credit-dependent nations, if not yet all, quote, credit card nations. Governments, enterprises, and especially the public had been borrowing at growing rates. In the previous chapter, I explored the reasons for growing personal debt, but the intertwined phenomena of competitive globalization and mergers and acquisitions led the corporate sector into massive debts as well. Finally, governments across the world had increasingly run deficits and thereby accumulated national debts in managing the contradictions of capitalist economies. The credit freeze posed a fundamental threat to a global capitalism dependent on global credit availability. This became clear first and most immediately in the United States, the center of the global markets in ABS and CDS. Some way had to be found, and fast, to unfreeze the credit markets. Otherwise, their freeze would be quickly transmitted by a globalized market system and disrupt the production and distribution of goods and services around the world. The tremor of an impending general capitalist collapse radiated out from its epicenter in New York. That concludes the first part of Chapter 2, and then it goes into Part 2.1, called The Bailouts and Federal Budget Deficits. I don't know if you want to take over then, or if you want me to continue.
No, I can pick up. Was there anything from that first section that you wanted to comment on?
It's all... I'm not going to lie, when it comes to CDSs and ABSs, it's a bit Greek to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that goes for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
But the knowledge that I have about it, as I mentioned last time, like, you know, watching the movie that I had, the Big Short, which talked about the crisis in 2008, that's really the extent of my knowledge of it. Because a lot of these things, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to macroeconomics that, like I said, are just really Greek to me, unfortunately.
No, I mean, you're right that I think is the case for most people, and I certainly struggle with some of it myself. But I mean, I guess if we were to try to simplify some of the overarching argument or narrative that Wolff is providing here, it'd be that there was a credit freeze, right? And that had repercussions
given
throughout
the
the system.
nature of such a credit-heavy economy.
Yes, exactly. And the lack of global credit availability pose serious threats. Okay, so and for the reasons that Wolff explained, because of the number of mortgages that can no longer be serviced, and the effect that had on the asset-backed securities and also the credit default swaps, the uncertainty that ensued and everything else. Okay, so we got the gist of that. I'll pick up at Section 2.1, the bailouts and federal budget deficits. The U.S. government's first step to bail out its major corporations and unfreeze credit markets was the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, created by Congress and President Bush in October 2008. That legislation provided $700 billion for the Treasury to use chiefly in two ways. The first entailed buying troubled assets, ABS and especially badly depressed MBS from banks and other financial institutions. These assets, often with depressed, falling, or uncertain value, were thus removed from the balance sheets of private financial enterprises and added to the balance sheet of the federal government. The second major use of TARP money was for buying special, usually non-voting, shares in banks and other corporations such as General Motors, AIG, and Citigroup. Just real quickly, before I forget, I'm going to insert here something that another pretty prolific and prominent proponent of worker cooperatives has said, an historian and political economist, Karl Purvitz, whose work dovetails with Wolff's quite a bit. You know, he's pointed out that the government more or less nationalized General Motors in some respects, as Wolff is documenting here, recounting, and that could have just as easily been turned over to democratic control, which kind of is, that relates to kind of what we were talking about before about the relationship between the state, when we were talking about when we weren't recording, the relationship between the state and the democratic or non-democratic control of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
How so? How was it able to...
I'm sorry?
Did they buy enough of General Motors to be able to make a decision like that and actually turn it over to
Well, they were non-voting shares, but they did... they propped up General Motors by buying enough shares that in large part, it was at least nationalized in part, right? And, what if they went further and did it more democratically is the question that Al Purvitz and others have posed. Is that, what if instead we turned it over to the workers and gave them the shares and let them decide how to run it? Because clearly
I wonder what the CEO would have said to that.
Yeah. Good question.
You know what? We're going into the ground instead, sorry.
Yeah, well, actually that's the decision that a lot of CEOs or major shareholders have made in the past when there have been pushes to convert an enterprise into something that's worker controlled. Like, for example, with the United Steelworkers back in the late 70s, I think in Youngstown, there's a good example where the steel plant was going to close, the steel mill, and, because they were, offshoring production or just were going to shut it down because they weren't able, the company, capitalist run, wasn't able to make as much money, make enough profits, and the workers really pushed to try to again buy it and own it collectively and operate it cooperatively, but there was real resistance from the corporation that had owned it. And this has been the case like in other places too, which is weird because sometimes it's even in their best interest, that is like those who own those properties, those productive properties. But, and I think Noam Chomsky has talked about this, how, it's maybe in their best individual interest, but there's a kind of, real dogmatic Marxist perspective just for the other side that they've adopted, a real class-conscious Marxism where they're like, no, in our class interest, this cannot abide.
They don't want to set a precedent, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's like so deeply ingrained and probably not even conscious in that respect, but they know when, something could be threatening the foundations upon which their wealth rests, So anyway, I will pick up where I left off. The purpose of these purchases was to enlarge the capital reserves of these corporations so that they would be more creditworthy and thus better able to obtain loans. A very small portion of funds went to the Making Home Affordable program, which was introduced by the Obama administration in 2009 to assist homeowners facing foreclosures. However, this program was never well funded or successful. TARP was a classic example of trickle-down economics, priming the pump mostly at the top of the economic pyramid in the hope that the resulting flow might trickle down to everyone else and thereby overcome the economic downturn. But the expected trickle failed to materialize. calls for banks to use their government assistance to renew lending to small and medium-sized businesses and to individuals went unheeded. Bank spokespersons explained that imprudent lending had gotten them into the crisis and they were not about to repeat that mistake. In short, the credit freeze was alleviated at the top of the credit system, but not enough to stop or reverse the downturn. The U.S. economy went from bad to worse in the last month of 2008 and the early months of 2009. Republicans and Democrats alike had agreed to try to deal with the deepening economic crisis by spending lavishly on stimulus programs but not taxing anyone to pay for them. Instead, the Treasury Department borrowed heavily, as usual, chiefly from banks, insurance companies, rich people, and foreign governments, and the national debt surged. Bush and Obama, Republicans and Democrats, all pursued and approved a government spending program financed by deficits. However, the November 2010 midterm election results strengthened Republicans as the right-wing Tea Party movement capitalized on growing popular discontent over economic problems and pressed its audience to vote Republican. The Republican Party led an intense, across-the-board opposition to Obama and his policies. Conservative forces attacked the fast-growing national debt and large current account deficits as the root problem, rediscovering classic arguments that cast them as dangerous burdens threatening to require future tax increases. Such arguments treated deficits as failures of the Obama administration rather than products of a capitalist crisis. Further, government outlays that required deficit spending thus became ever harder to pass in Congress. Of course, stimulus programs could have been financed by taxation. It would have made good economic sense to tax corporations and the richest individuals, especially given that the impact on their spending would likely have been minimal, and spend the revenues on Washington's large budget deficits. Working and poor people would have spent the great part of any such stimulus money and thereby significantly multiplied its positive economic effects. Instead, corporations accumulated huge cash hoards since spending on investment or growth made no sense in a depressed, declining economy. Likewise, the rich, who had become relatively much richer over the previous 30 years, spent little of their income in a down economy. In short, these non-spenders, and using the revenues to spend on economic stimulus programs, would have been a classic anti-crisis program. And such a robust, tax-based stimulus program would incur little or no budget deficit, and thus a lower increase in the national debt, if any. But neither Republicans nor most Democrats dared move in that direction for fear of alienating the corporations and the rich. After 30 years of skyrocketing corporate profits, especially for large corporations, during which the top 1% of income earners had become much richer relative to the other 99%, major parties and politicians had become much more dependent on the financial support of those two groups than ever before. Workers' stagnant wages, coupled with the extra hours of household members' labor and the anxieties of rising individual debt, had combined to sharply lessen mass participation and even interest in politics. Meanwhile, growing income and wealth inequality motivated corporations and the rich to use their enhanced resources to shape politics so that government would protect their new financial gains from the envy, resentment, and demands of the 99%. I'll stop there if you want to pick up.
Sure.
Did you have any thoughts on what I just read?
Go ahead if you have any thoughts. I'm sort of a lot of the things that you talked about were kind of refreshing in my mind what was going on with myself in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I was at the time I was working at Quiznos, and I remember my boss ended up closing down his franchise.
Oh wow!
Because of what was going on, and so he had a franchise, like I said, of a Quiznos that had worked at for a couple years, and he ended up closing it down and going to work as an ops manager for the LA Fitness, actually, that I'm at now. And he ended up getting me a job there eventually, but I was jobless for a good couple months. It was pretty tough. And so that was kind of just what I was thinking as you're reading the kind of the repercussions, at least in my life. And I can only imagine how others dealt with it.
Did your boss ever comment on the situation?
Well, the other thing I was going to mention, which may not be appropriate, is that I was obviously quite younger. I was 20 at the time, and I was in full swing of a sort of a, you could say, hedonistic party lifestyle I was in at the time, and so I was not really concerned with these things.
Well, sure.
I can't really say that. I mean, I was affected by it in that the place I worked at shut down, obviously. But
yeah.
I was only jobless for maybe, I think it was actually probably only about a month or two. And then I ended up getting a job at LA Fitness where he was working at. And then I immediately got a job a couple months later somewhere else. But I don't really, the only other thing I remember was like the stimulus package where I don't remember exactly how it worked out, but I think at tax time, Bush's proposal or whatever it was, I ended up getting like an extra $100 for on my taxes or something like this, and thinking, oh yeah, great, I got an extra $100, but like I said before, I wasn't really in a position in which I really cared about those types of things, and so I can't really comment too much about it, unfortunately. But yeah, go ahead if you've got something.
No, I don't have any valuable personal stories, really. That was when I had started grad school, working on on my master's program, and actually had a public service internship through the state government, which wasn't at least immediately affected at all by it at the time. Although Illinois state government finances have been in the news quite a bit in the last couple of years, for sure. But at the time, it wasn't. I think there was discussion of it, and I was aware of some of the debates and what was going on, and of the crisis. Although not immediately, probably more certainly in the aftermath. But I guess I wasn't in the midst of maybe a hedonistic phase, but I wasn't maybe as attuned to it as I would have been, partly because of the work and the grad school and just being a little overwhelmed. But
I gotcha.
I remember a couple of years afterward, like around the time that Occupy kicked off in 2011, I became really, really interested in what had happened. And so it's good to, well, it's interesting now to get Wolff's recounting, which I think I've read through this book or skimmed it before, but I didn't necessarily remember or take everything to memory. So it's good to get this refresher, I guess.
Exactly.
Do you want to
pick up?
Yeah. Yeah.
Remarkably, no proposal to fund the bulk of federal stimulus spending by taxing corporations or the rich was ever seriously entertained by either party. Surprise, surprise. No programs for social welfare spending or federal job creation, like those enacted during FDR's New Deal, were ever seriously debated, let alone passed. The economic model that led to growing income and wealth inequalities and caused the crisis had so captured the two-party political system that it was incapable of mobilizing sufficient fiscal stimulus to reverse or even stop the unfolding economic decline. Political dysfunction aggravated economic dysfunction. As this became clear, an increasing number of people began to question the system as a whole, the social combination of such an economy and such a politics. When the crisis persisted in the years after 2008, conventionally partisan criticisms of this or that aspect of the system gave way to criticism of the entire system. The right, as usual, blamed poor people for taking out loans they could not afford and government economic policies for blocking or distorting what would otherwise have been a smoothly growing and profitable private enterprise market capitalism. The left, as usual, blamed greedy financial and other corporate interests and insufficient government regulation of them for the economic crisis. But a significant and growing constituency rejected efforts to blame the parts in favor of questioning the whole. The system was the problem. More people came to feel that the economic crisis was endemic to the capitalist system, part of its normal mode of operation. So that concludes part 2.1 of Chapter 2. This next part, 2.2, is called The Bailouts and the National Debt. James, did you have anything to comment on that last part?
No, only I guess I'm curious, again, regarding your anecdotal experience, as to whether you encountered any of that growing constituency that rejected the efforts to blame the parts in favor of questioning the whole when around this time.
So first off, as far as the right is concerned, I don't think I was mingling in any crowds in which that argument came up. I never heard someone, although I've heard it since then from individuals because I've been more involved with these things, but I never heard someone give the whole, well, those people should have been paying their mortgages and it's their fault, etc., blah, blah.
And I wonder to what extent people actually, again, paid attention enough to know that it was part of the whole string of crises had something to do with the fact that the people had taken out loans that they were like pressured to, in many cases, the subprime mortgages, and then couldn't afford to pay them, especially given how some of them, the amount they had to pay, monthly amount, like just skyrocketed in many cases because of the various workings of the financial system and the way that private enterprises were run, and because of the fact that the subprime mortgages are kind of a scam to begin with. But I wonder if people even made that connection though, or if they were just like us, if they were just very much in tune with their own everyday goings-ons and didn't understand that it was in large part a housing crisis.
I think that I do give credit to those who, I think there was there started to be a lot more emphasis on the problem of crony capitalism from both the right and the left. I started hearing, maybe not around this time between 2008 and 12, but I think that probably since 2011 you're starting to hear a lot more about the issue of crony capitalism, both on the right and the left. But I did want to mention that I really do recommend you watch The Big Short, because they do a good job of showing examples of how individuals were given certain loans for houses, in which the individuals who were working for banks or whatever the institutions were that were giving out these loans, they were kind of given free rein to just give loans out to anyone, no matter what their applications said. And so, again, just wanted to say that. And so, but other than that, I don't know. Like I said, at the time, I wasn't really hearing nuanced arguments about the housing crisis, and I wasn't exactly surrounded by people who owned houses. Let's just put it that way.
Well, yeah, me neither.
So it was definitely above our heads, and so we didn't really have too much to say about it. But I think that some of us really did kind of feel like I did have some individuals who were very, very much quite pissed off at TARP and what that was really doing, basically propping up a system that they felt shouldn't have been propped up, and let it die kind of yells from the crowd that I heard, even though I also heard contra those points that by doing that we would have seen chaos, unimaginable, to that, unlike anything we've ever seen before. So and even that, I don't know to what extent that's true. I'm kind of guessing it is. If we didn't bail them out, what kind of things would happen? I'm pretty sure things would be much more dire than they were. I think it was just to put it really, really in low-term keys, it was a bitter pill that we had to swallow. But that's really all I have to say about those things.
Uh-huh. And no, I certainly heard, I think, some of those arguments as well. And I think what Wolff is suggesting here is that, as others have before, although he has his own particular angle to it, is that, yes, I think he would agree that were there to be no sort of bailout or government intervention in the system in the wake of the crisis, then yeah, that could have been catastrophic for the economic system as a whole, possibly could have led to a much deeper recession or depression in the U.S. or elsewhere. But I think he would also stress that the bitter pill did not necessarily have to be as bitter or as structured in the way that it was, right? Like,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's the thing. It's like, but that was off the table because there was the bipartisan consensus that, any meaningful way of dealing with what's at root here, like, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be prudent, right? That was the
remember
agreement.
Congressmen and women complaining about when they were given the proposal of TARP and other, reactions to this other forms of the bailout, that they weren't given sufficient time to look things over.
Right.
And they were kind of, hoodwinked in certain ways. And so, but I mean, on the other hand, it was voted for, and, the yays were there or whatever. And so I don't know how much to put into that.
I mean, so I think one thing that might be worth trying to parse out real briefly is the extent to which maybe those on the left, as typical or as usual, as Wolff put it, were to a degree on the more mainstream left critical of the lack of perhaps Wall Street regulation that accompanied or did not accompany some of the government intervention in the wake of the crisis when it emerged.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that also is still within pretty narrow ideological and, well, indeed, practical and material economic bounds, because it didn't involve, as we suggested, nationalizing General Motors or any of the big banks and putting them under, more democratic public control or anything like that, which would have been crazy talk. But it's weird because I bet a lot of the folks that you encountered, and I think those that I encountered too, who were following this at all, like, that were critical of crony capitalism, they might not have been opposed to that sort of thing, even those maybe on the right. I do remember, I was going to add this too, that I think you had said that maybe those criticisms didn't reach to the level of being audible, metaphorically speaking, clearly audible, until around 2010 or 11. And that would have been around the time, as Wolff had pointed out, that the Tea Party movement emerged, and then in 2011, in September, Occupy Wall Street started, and I think totally changed the national discourse, if, not radically, but certainly noticeably. But prior to that, I think, at least in my experience, around 2008, there was a real resurgence in kind of libertarian thought, and we've talked a bit about this before.
I was actually going to bring this up about 5 minutes ago. I'm glad you said that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, I mean, I know folks from back home who became huge Ron Paul supporters around 2008.
Yep. Oh God, the internet felt that. The internet felt that quake.
Yeah, and early, before YouTube was a huge thing and all the rest. So. And but I mean, and as I pointed out before, right? I mean, I think that speaks to legitimate concerns, but a critique that has serious shortcomings. More so than I would argue Wolff's probably does, as we will, I think, continue to find out and discover as we read the rest of this book.
Absolutely, and I think one of the biggest things that the libertarians were railing against was TARP and those types of measures. And that really brought to light the severity of crony capitalism, it just really a spotlight on it at the time, which in a way kind of brought certain ideologies together that maybe were not before.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, so kind of like a lot of, but I mean, but like you said, it kind of turned out to, it kind of brought about certain perspectives that became, you know, I don't know, maybe too exaggerated or too, I don't know, a little bit too outside of the box, maybe you could say, but it was good to see individuals kind of who saw that crony capitalism was occurring at a level that they couldn't even have imagined before with TARP and with you know, with the other measures that occurred. And although I just wish that the arguments could have been honed in a more practical way and actually brought people more to the center, as opposed to creating this third thing called libertarianism, which really is just I don't know. I don't see it as really a long-term political party, as opposed to just being a sort of a reactionary outcry against crony capitalism, I guess. But I don't know. Anyways, we'll continue this chapter next time, or did you want to try to get more in? I'm not sure.
We can call it a day, I think.
Okay.
And we will try to get through at least a good chunk of chapter 2 next time we read, if not all of it. And we'll be resuming then, starting, was it section 2.2?
Correct.
Okay. So until next time, folks, this has been the North County San Diego Democracy at Work Action Group reading and discussion of Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism.